Hi, everybody. Welcome to video part 4. So we have talked about the restorative response system theory overall. We talked about fight and we talked about flight. So here we are today to talk about freeze. And the restorative response to freeze is resolve. So Pepper, unpack this for us.
Yes. So let's start with the fact that when we talk about freeze, there's two types of freezes, right?
Okay.
So there's the hyper freeze, which I liken to a deer in the headlights.
Okay.
And then there's the hypo freeze, which is like that possum playing dead situation, right?
Okay.
So we went with resolve instead of thaw, but it's the same situation. And so a reminder again that when you're in these trauma reactions, they're perfectly normal reactions. We don't want to fight against them. And when you're in a freeze in particular, it's really hard to think about doing anything but staying frozen. Like your brain literally freezes. There's no, oh, look, I'm in a freeze, so let me do A, B, and C to get out of that freeze, right?
Right.
Non-compute is what's happening up here.
Yes.
So I really want to remind everyone that, this is not, the freeze is kind of tricky because it's not one that unless you are very aware it's your go-to and you're very practiced at recognizing it as your go-to, that you're going to immediately go, oh, let me resolve this. So when we talk about resolve or thawing out, this is where I find things like the weighted blanket can be very helpful.
Okay.
And taking that walk in the yard barefoot, that grounding piece can be very helpful. But that can't happen until you get to a place that you recognize, oh, I'm in a freeze response.
Yes. And how do you do that?
Oftentimes, so I've gotten to where I recognize it immediately, like I'll be talking about something and then my brain will just go freeze. And I'm like, oh, look, I'm in a freeze response. And so let's talk a little bit about what freeze can look like.
Okay.
Freeze can look like you have, instead of intrusive thoughts, your mind just goes blank.
Okay.
Freeze can look like you're in the middle of something and you forget why you walked in that room.
Yes. Okay.
And it can also, like when you are in, and this is a unique one. So you remember in Linda Ty's class where she talked about this, your body going into a freeze where you're very emotional and maybe you're crying and you get to that place in the sob that you're like,
yes.
Right? That's a type of freeze. Right? And it's like this deer, it's similar to that deer in the headlights, but you're trying to like break out of it. And oftentimes what happens is when you're in the freeze, you'll move to another response. So maybe you'll move to that fawning response.
Okay.
Maybe you'll move to that now I want to fight somebody response, right?
Yeah.
And all perfectly normal, all perfectly acceptable, right?
Why is that, Pepper? Why does freeze almost become an interim trauma response?
That's such a great question. And I think that it warrants just kind of a discussion of how we even get there, right? So what would you say is something that puts you even in a freeze?
Shame.
Shame, right? And shame is present when we hit denial, attack self, attack other, withdraw.
Yes.
And I believe that personally, I believe that withdrawal piece is very bonded with the freeze.
Yes.
Whereas the attack self piece might be more related to that fawning piece.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Or even fight.
Yep. Yeah.
If I'm going to attack myself.
I'm going to fight myself.
Yeah.
Instead of I can't fight you, so I'm going to fight myself.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And freeze can also be associated with that numbing out.
True.
I don't want to feel this. I'm in the middle of being attacked. I'm in the middle of being violated. So I'm going to numb out. And for me, in my history with trauma, I would numb out, but my mind would go somewhere completely other. And it
Yeah.
would be this fantastical world that I created for myself where I was a rock star, a queen, all these things, while this horrible nightmare is happening in the present moment. But
Yes.
I'm all the way gone
Yes.
mentally.
Yes. Yes.
That's a type
Okay.
of freeze.
Yeah. You've escaped.
Yep. So when I come back into the present moment and walk away like nothing happened, right? Like that can
Yeah.
sometimes be the situation.
Of course.
That's
Yeah.
what it can, like, that's a false resolve.
You're right. You're right. Because like you said, that's just a walk away. There's no resolution of what it was that kicked you into that trauma response. So it's a
Right.
full resolve.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you go into the shame piece. Well, it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't dressed this way. It wouldn't have happened if I hadn't smarted off. It wouldn't have happened if all these reasons, right? Attack self.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes. So we've moved from the freeze into, okay, now I understand. Now I get it.
yeah. And that's often what happens is, where there is trauma, there is shame.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you'll feel like you have resolved when you move to shame.
Okay. Okay.
But the truth of the matter is that when you think of what is the antithesis of shame, it's curiosity.
It's true.
So when you want to resolve, you want to start getting curious. Why did I freeze?
What happened?
What was my freeze trigger?
Yeah.
How can I identify the precursor of that trigger?
Yes.
So we've talked about in class a few times about this word titration.
Yes.
And it's this getting close to and retreating from.
Right.
So getting close to that trigger and then retreating from it. And the thing about freeze is I experience freeze as a trigger more than an actual trauma response. So when instead of my go-to is usually a fawning response, but when post trauma,
Right.
it'll start bubbling back up and I'll freeze.
Okay.
If I feel like I'm getting close to it, I'll freeze. If, however, I want to resolve that, what I do is that titration piece. Let me get courageous. Let me bravely and boldly walk towards the thing that scares me.
Yes.
And then take a step back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a gift we give ourselves in our healing journey, because to go close but not engage with or fall back into, and instead observe and come back from, that coming back. You might move into flight on your way back. That's okay, because remember, we rise in flight to meet ourselves there, and then we can resolve it. This is a landing.
I love it.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. In fact, it's interesting because I just read about a book by Dr. Kristen Lee, and she talks about using micro doses of bravery.
Yes.
To encounter new things, learn new things, approach things that we're uncomfortable with. And as you were talking about that titration process, that's exactly what came into my mind. Not to set ourselves up to think that I have to, storm up to that thing that scares the bejeepers out of me and confront it and resolve it in that moment. But that I can have an approach and a back, an approach and a back.
Yes.
That's okay.
And another element to this that I have seen in my practice more and more with clients is when they're used to a freeze, when that's their go-to, doing something vocally really adds a nice vibration to resolve.
Really?
So, and I'm still going deeper into why that is.
Yeah.
But I think it's because one of the things that happens in a freeze is that our throat locks up. Sometimes we get that knot in our throat, or when you're in that breathing situation.
Right.
And if you can, and my child and I do this, where we're having like this frustration, right? And it's more of a fight response, but then we'll move into like, we don't know where to go from here. So we're kind of frozen, right?
Yes.
And we'll do this exercise where we breathe in and we allow a vocal exhale. So it's something like, and it's just like adding that frustration, adding that vibration. Practicing your autonomy is very powerful. Your voice is so powerful, and we take it for granted, our voices, when we're used to it being ignored. And when I was working with animals a lot, we would see them go from fight to what we called shutdown, which is that hypo freeze, that I'm just going to play dead.
Yes.
And that would be when the dog would go from barking to silence and just shut down.
Yeah.
So getting them to move forward, taking a walk, is very powerful when you find yourself at a freeze.
Moving.
Forward motion. Yep. Forward motion. Adding a vibration in the body somewhere. Where in the body do you feel most frozen? Get a vibration going there. I've had clients do like just a gentle sway like this when they find themselves in a freeze response. And it helps them come back to this present moment.
Yeah. Do you think because you use the word condition, and I like that, because if we realize, okay, I have a standard freeze response, it's my go-to. If I can find that moment of recognition that I'm moving, that doing these things like putting in the sway or putting in the vibration can then keep us from tipping over into the freeze response?
Yes, because you think about the window of capacity, and I talk about that in the book, but you think about the window of capacity, and the hyperfreeze sets up here.
Yes.
And the hypofreeze sits down here in dorsal, right?
Right.
So when you find yourself, we always pretend like it's an ebb and flow, but there's some points where it is a sharp dive. Yep. And if you find yourself in a hyperfreeze where you're, that deer in the headlights of, oh my gosh, shock, awe, intensity. Right. And then there's I just want to die. I just want to be like Eeyore, depressed. I'm done. Right. Yeah. I don't want to move. And if you can, again, like that, the power of a walk, the power of a gentle sway, adding a movement helps you resolve and get present back in this moment. Right. Freeze makes you want to disassociate and not be in this painful moment.
Yes.
But you can't heal what you don't feel.
No.
And I'm not, and again, because of titration, we don't have to go right to it.
No.
But we can walk boldly towards it, and we can remove ourselves from, and sometimes it's a form of teaching ourselves to rescue ourselves.
Yes.
Right? We don't have
There's
to be
the agency.
Yes.
There's the agency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing with freeze is, again, not shaming yourself for freezing.
Yeah.
Because that's a false resolve.
Yes.
But if instead you catch it and you go, that was a perfectly normal response to a ridiculously abnormal situation. Let me give myself some compassion.
Yeah. Yes.
Let me get some forward motion going so that my brain can come back online.
Yes. And compassion does that.
Mm-hmm.
Compassion does that. And that recognition, and you talked about curiosity being the opposite of shame, and I think compassion is an antidote.
Yes.
To shame.
Yes. No. And we talk about that in the book about, being the antidote for yourself and being the antidote for the world.
Yes.
I remember one time early on in my recovery, I was in a Walmart, and somebody walked by who looked like one of my abusers. And I just felt like this cloud, this intensity. And I must have been standing there for a while, because I had this cart full of stuff, and I was just like, the whole time. And so fortunately for me, a worker at this particular Walmart came over and said, "Are you ready to check out?" And I was just like, yeah. And I could not function. And she walks me down to the front, takes me to the register, checks me out with all my stuff, and walked me to my car and said, "Just take your time. You're okay." And went back to their job.
Right.
And I was very fortunate, but I was in a hyper freeze. I could
Right.
not think, I could not function, but by moving forward with somebody holding my hand and
Yes.
getting back to my car where I happen to feel safe in my car,
Yes.
and then I was able to come back and just like, what happened? What just took place? What is this?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so I called the hotline. I called the crisis hotline and was like, I don't know what just happened to me, but this is what's going on in my life. And they were like, oh, well, you sound like you might have been on the verge of a panic attack. And they walked me through how to, put your feet flat on the floor. They gave me, they read a sequence of numbers out of order, and reading a sequence of numbers out of order made my brain go, wait a second, that's not correct. That it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 6. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4.
Prefrontal cortex comes back and goes, wait a minute. Ooh,
Yes.
never heard of that one. I like that one.
Right?
Yeah.
So as they walked me through it, it helped me. Like, I was coming out of it, but as they walked me through how to respond the next time I think I might be heading towards a panic attack, the feet flat on the ground. And then, another good one is tapping.
Yes.
I sometimes will just start doing this when I'm like, why am I not thinking of the thing? Or my other favorite is, I really like to tap right here.
Yeah.
This is my other favorite. Like, okay.
Collarbone. Yeah.
Sometimes we don't always mentally freeze. Sometimes we just emotionally freeze.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so for that one, I like to go here. Like, I don't even know how to feel right now. Let me sit with that. Let's let that land. And that's an important piece. Let it land.
Let it land. And as we have talked about in each one of these videos, it's about not struggling against it, but moving with it.
Right.
Not, to honor that body's response, honor your body and your brain's response to the trauma.
If you're in a freeze, you're supposed to be, for some reason or other. And it won't always make sense to the logical brain.
Right.
And it might be something present moment, and it might be something from the past that got triggered in this present moment.
In this moment.
But your nervous system doesn't know. It's not bound by time.
No.
Which is why the healing journey can be this, or it can be this, or it can be this, and it is uniquely yours.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Fantastic. This is wonderful. Pepper, thank you so much for walking us through freeze. So everybody stay tuned. We are going to move on to video number 4. Is it 4? No, 5.
5.
Video 5, fawn. So stay with us and we will be right back.